Good evening. The book Nordic Whiteness and Migration to the USA appears at an opportune moment when the world seeks a reckoning of racial injustices. In the historical exploration of identity focused on Nordic immigrants, the book examines racial hierarchies they encountered, offering frameworks for understanding racial tensions. The work is especially meaningful now in the wake of George Floyd's killing on May 25th in Minneapolis, an area settled by many Nordic immigrants. The video enabled viewers to see firsthand his brutal death. A white police officer, Derek Chauvin, pressed his knee on the neck of an unarmed black man lying face down in the street for more than 8 minutes. Hands in his pocket, casually staring into the camera. 3 other officers failed to intervene as Floyd repeated the words, "I can't breathe." The recording, made by a teenage girl accompanying her young cousin on a walk to the store, provided a grim vision of racial injustice and stunned humanity. A cry heard round the world. Then came protests, marches, and calls for change, a reckoning after long-standing patterns of injustice. In the so-called New World, this meant the effects of colonization, the slave trade, settler colonialism, Jim Crow laws, racial hierarchies, racial injustices. The lingering effects of these in Minneapolis and the nation touch us still. Today, however, most Americans gradually recognize and acknowledge the effects of racial injustice. Initially, the calls centered on police brutality and criminal justice reform. Black Lives Matter long sought to expose issues of policing. Now most citizens echo their questions. Why is that maneuver allowed? Why don't others intervene? Why is Chauvin still an officer with 17 disciplinary actions against him? Why doesn't he live in the city he polices? Policing, along with the criminal justice system, often remains hidden from the public, though more attention is now exposing these systems and the blue wall of silence. However, systemic racism is racial inequity built into complex systems, often obscure and embedded in public and private entities. Criminal justice, education, healthcare, banking, employment, and housing. The invisibility of the systems means citizens lack knowledge of how they work. Yet they impact all indicators of well-being: income, healthcare, education, and housing. Thus also achievement and mortality. In these areas, Minneapolis, despite its progressive politics, remains among the worst cities in the nation for racial disparities. Perhaps the most hidden and enduring example of systemic racism is the racial covenant and the likely cause of the disparities in Minneapolis. Racial covenants were legal clauses attached to property records, restricting home ownership to protect white neighborhoods from perceived undesirables. Such persons, seen as non-white, were identified as Negro, mulatto, colored, and so on, reflecting the pervasive racial thinking of the Jim Crow era. The racial covenants existed in cities across the U.S., including Chicago, San Francisco, and Seattle, cities also with many Nordics living there. Thus, the covenants provided a system of segregated housing in the North, later justified by developers, bankers, and lenders to preserve property values, and endorsed by the Federal Housing Administration. The first racial covenants in Minneapolis appeared in 1910 in Prospect Park after two black families purchased homes there. As the cities grew, so did the covenants. By the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, much of the city had white neighborhoods by design. My parents purchased a bungalow in South Minneapolis in 1946. Both, however, grew up in the Red River Valley, descendants of Norwegian immigrants. So I am third generation on one side, on the other, fourth generation immigrant. As a child born in Minneapolis, I tried to make sense of a confusing world. After Floyd's death, I recall bus rides as an 8-year-old with my mother to eye appointments downtown. When I was young, we lived in the Standish neighborhood, named for the primary school I attended, and within walking distance of the Norwegian Lutheran church the family attended. A few blocks from Lake Hiawatha and 2 blocks from the 38th Street bus line. I knew the neighborhood. I knew the kids. We were all white. But childhood memories of those bus rides still remain vivid to me. Mother and I took the 38th Street bus to Nicollet Avenue, where we caught a streetcar downtown. The 38th Street bus crossed the city and many busy intersections like Chicago Avenue, the site of Floyd's death. West of there, we crossed 10th, 9th, and then 5th, 4th, 3rd Avenues. On those later streets, I saw outside the bus window only black children playing. Puzzled, I asked myself, then, why do all the black kids live here? I could not understand. There were no black kids on our streets in our school. Today, we slowly grasp the reasons racial covenants protected white neighborhoods. But the long history came with enormous consequences on racial disparities and race relations. In 1953, the Minnesota legislature barred new racial covenants, and in 1962, it prohibited housing discrimination on the basis of race, religion, and national origin. But significantly, in 1968, the U.S. Congress passed the Fair Housing Act, which made racial covenants illegal throughout the nation. Still, the advantages of secure, stable housing with long-term mortgages offered white immigrants monetary benefits denied non-whites. Only recently do scholars, especially historians and geographers, map the cities based on the racial covenants and expose the injustices of Jim Crow practices that remain hidden, but benefited white citizens and white immigrants with long-term advantages. Thank you very much.